In the later half of the 20th century and early part of the 21st century, Venezuela was the richest nation in South America thanks to a booming economy associated with the nation's vast amounts of oil reserves. But around a decade ago, this all changed, turning it into the poorest nation on the continent. What exactly happened? And can Venezuela reverse their misfortunes? Let's find out. Venezuela is a South American nation located on the northeastern coastline of South America. The nation has a rich and complex history that spans many centuries, marked by periods of profound cultural, political, and economic changes. Before the arrival of Europeans, the region of modern-day Venezuela was inhabited by various indigenous groups such as the Caribs, Arawaks, and the Timbuktuicos. These groups were primarily engaged in agriculture, hunting, and fishing. Venezuela was first sighted by Christopher Columbus in 1498. Spanish colonization began in earnest in the 16th century. The Spanish exploited the region for its natural resources, particularly cacao and pearls. The colonial economy was based on agriculture and the forced labor of indigenous people and African slaves. The struggle for independence began in the early 19th century, influenced by a broader wave of independence movements across Latin America. Led by figures like Simón Bolívar and Francisco de Miranda, Venezuela officially became independent from Spain in 1830 after being part of Gran Colombia, a state that included Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama. The discovery of vast oil reserves in the early 20th century transformed Venezuela's economy and society. By the mid-20th century, it became one of the world's leading oil exporters. This wealth funded extensive social welfare programs and modernization projects. However, it also led to economic disparities and political instability. From the late 1950s until the late 1990s, Venezuela was a relatively stable democracy. However, the wealth from oil led to corruption and significant economic inequality. Then in 1998, Hugo Chavez was elected president, promising economic reforms and social justice under the banner of the Bolivarian Revolution. Chavez's policies included nationalizing significant sectors of the economy and implementing social programs funded by oil revenue. His tenure was marked by a deepening of political polarization, economic dependence on oil, and increasing government control over various sectors. Following Chavez's death in 2013, Nicolas Maduro took office, and the nation took a turn towards becoming more and more autocratic. Also, the economy started its downward spiral thanks to oil prices decreasing, Venezuela's main export. By the late 2010s, Venezuela was in deep economic trouble. Today, the nation has many financial and societal woes, including a shrinking GDP and per capita incomes, hyperinflation, food shortages, and mass emigration due to these issues. To look more into this, let's look at some economic statistics. As of 2023, Venezuela has a GDP purchasing power parity of around $212 billion, down nearly $200 billion from its record high of $396 billion in 2010. The per capita incomes also decreased with lowering GDPs and average around $8,000 a year, but many people make significantly less than that. While oil was historically a major economic driver for Venezuela, it doesn't drill as much as it did a decade or two ago. Right now, the nation drills around 800,000 barrels of oil a day, but in 2014, they were drilling nearly 3 million barrels a day, and in 1997, 3.3 million barrels a day. Besides oil, Venezuela has other primary and secondary sector industries, including agriculture, livestock raising, machinery equipment, and iron and steel production. The Human Development Index, which measures health, income, and education attributes, averages 0.691, considered medium, but is among the lowest in South America. Venezuela's credit rating, a measure of financial stability in individual nations, is listed as in default, meaning that it's pretty much in a depression. And unfortunately, predictions are showing that further economic decline will occur this year into the next. The reasons for Venezuela's economic problems are complicated. Since oil was discovered there in the 1920s, the nation has taken advantage of the liquid gold, so much that it did make it the richest nation in Latin America at one time. The nation is considered a petrostate, one who is heavily dependent on exporting oil. Others include Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Nigeria, and Norway, one of the two within Europe, with Russia being the other. In the early 1970s, when oil prices globally increased, Venezuela had higher per capita incomes than some developed European nations, including its past colonizer Spain. This led to nationalizing the oil industry, which allowed for increased government spending on social programs, but adding to the national debt. But by the early 1980s, the world entered an oil glut period where supplies became high and demand lower, thus creating an economic crisis for Venezuela, lowering the standard of living. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Venezuelan government started to create economic reforms to improve the economic troubles, including tax increases and spending cuts, resulting in Hugo Chavez's Bolivarian Revolutionary Army, a socialist movement attempting to overthrow the government of Carlos Andrés Pérez twice in 1992, both of which failed. Chavez was imprisoned for 2 years, and Pérez was impeached as president in 1993 due to corruption charges. But in 1998, with Venezuelans tired of the political drama within the nation, Chavez won the 1998 election with the lowest turnout for an election in history. After he became president, he began promoting social reforms to help the poorest people in the nation, including the Bolivarian missions, which aimed at providing education, housing, and food. Also during the early 2000s, oil prices began to dramatically increase, which further allowed these reforms to be funded. At the same time, Chavez nationalized other key industries, including the telephone and electricity sectors. But in early 2004, nationwide protests broke out because some Venezuelans were dissatisfied with the direction the nation was headed, including redistribution of wealth, neglect of other social problems such as high crime rates, and concerns about Chavez becoming increasingly autocratic. In August 2004, a recall vote was held, but failed to remove Chavez. In July of 2008, oil prices hit an all-time record high of $147 a barrel, bringing in revenue to the Venezuelan government, considering many sectors of its economy were nationalized. At this time, the quality of life for the poorer citizens did temporarily increase in categories such as literacy and education. However, things were starting to unravel. Although nationalizing key industries and price controls were to control prices of goods, they led to other deficits such as shortages, with one being food shortages in supermarkets. In addition, in the early 2010s, oil prices began to fall considerably, and since Venezuela's main export was oil, revenue from that tanked. That pretty much created a domino effect of major economic and societal issues. To counter this, Chavez's government printed more money, making the Bolivar currency devalue and for inflation to start increasing. Merchants and citizens had to resort to the black market to find necessary items due to higher inflation and shortages, but this was also unhelpful in certain circumstances since cartels associated with the black market items inflated their prices. In 2013, Hugo Chavez died from cancer, and Nicolás Maduro, the vice president at the time, became president, and went on to win the special 2013 election over Enrique Capriles by only 1.5%. After he became president, Maduro continued Chavez's ideological principles and became way more autocratic. A combination of oil prices sinking and production falling and economic sanctions put into effect from other nations further decreased the Venezuelan economy into freefall. The GDP and per capita incomes continued their decreases, and inflation skyrocketed to a record 345,000% in February 2019. In the last decade, Venezuela's economy and geopolitical conditions have changed for the worse, with fiscal problems still plaguing the nation and Maduro's government pretty much becoming an autocracy, with human rights abuses and rigged elections. Because of this, many Venezuelans have emigrated out of the nation, with 1 in 10 migrating to other Latin American nations and the US. Who's to blame for the economic instability of Venezuela? This question is also complicated to answer. Venezuela was a Spanish colony until 1811, when it declared its independence. While colonialism did have some negative effects, it's not the root cause of Venezuela's problems. Pretty much, the events that occurred from the early 1800s to now are what created the issues. Years of governmental corruption, fiscal mismanagement, government coups, and reliance on oil exclusively for money created the problems of today for the nation. And Hugo Chavez, being a modern-day Robin Hood, certainly didn't help out, as a redistribution of wealth and a nationalization of key industries, along with price controls, created more instability. The sad truth of the matter is that it didn't have to turn out this way. Norway is a petrostate like Venezuela. However, the nation has managed its oil wealth through a sovereign wealth fund known as the Government Pension Fund Global, which invests surplus revenues from the petroleum sector to avoid inflation and overheating of the economy. This has provided financial stability and resources to fund social programs sustainably. Venezuela, on the other hand, relied heavily on oil revenue for government spending without sufficient investment in other sectors of the economy. This lack of diversification made the economy extremely vulnerable to fluctuations in oil prices. Governmentally, Norway is a stable democracy with a high level of checks and balances and very limited corruption. And Venezuela, on the other hand, is considered an authoritarian dictatorship with high levels of corruption and mismanagement. In order for Venezuela to turn around their misfortunes, proactive change is needed. For one, corruption must be dealt with. As of this year, Venezuela is the third most corrupt nation in the world, just ahead of South Sudan and Somalia. Corruption hurts everything and everyone, and by it being this bad, Venezuelans are suffering. Governmentally, Venezuela is considered an autocratic federal presidential republic, which means while there still are elections, the current government under Nicolas Maduro is pretty much a dictatorship. A presidential election is going to occur on July 28, 2024, and according to current polls, Edmundo Gonzalez, associated with the Unitary Platform Party, a centrist anti-socialist party, is ahead in the polls. But in past elections, Maduro's government was accused of rigging elections, which made him win. This means that this election may be rigged as well. If Maduro stays in power, his policies will continue to remain in place, creating further difficulties. However, if there is some sort of political shift, Venezuela can start to reform itself. First, the nation has estimated oil reserves of around 304 billion barrels, the most of any nation. While the nation only produces 800,000 barrels a day, it has the reserves needed to produce way more than that. If Venezuela were to drill as much as the US does per day, around 18 million barrels, it can do this for 46 years, not considering that more reserves may be found. With oil prices globally increasing, Venezuela could benefit from increasing drilling and exporting it. Of course, governmentally, sanctions from other nations, including the US, would have to be lifted, and this may happen if a new non-corrupt democratic president is elected. If all these things come into place, Venezuela can then set up a sovereign wealth fund like Norway's, which would save wealth for future generations, be invested in a variety of assets, diversify the economy, and to fund desperately needed infrastructural projects. With these protocols put into place, Venezuela would likely see higher GDPs and per capita incomes, higher human development indexes, and a calming down of inflation. If things do stabilize economically, socially, and governmentally, tourism can be another added economic incentive. Venezuela is situated in a tropical latitude with a scenic geomorphology. These attributes give the nation a charming appearance, so tourists may be drawn to this, thus creating more revenue and employment opportunities. Venezuela is a nation with a unique and distinctive history, as well as a fascinating culture. These positive attributes are vital to a nation, but if certain negative traits outweigh the positive ones, this can spark trouble. The current situation Venezuela is in is difficult, however, it can be fixed gradually with practical solutions. Pretty much, Venezuela can be the Norway of South America as a prominent petrostate connected to a non-corrupt government. Do you think that Venezuela has a chance of recovering from its troubles? If you have an opinion, please leave your feedback in the comment section below. That concludes today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, if you enjoy geography and earth science, be sure to subscribe to my channel, Our World, Our Planet, Our Home. Until next time!